through which a strong current flows, and I am certain that there is a backbone of terra firma underneath these barriers of ice, through which this passage cuts and is as permanent and clearly defined as the Straits of Magellan or Gibraltar. I have a theory, but as it must be elucidated in dry deductions of scientific reasoning, I will not inject it into this narrative. It is my intention, though, as soon as possible to prepare a more elaborate work, which I am constrained to believe, will be a valuable addition to scientific literature. It is probable that this passage is sometimes closed by ice packs, or the entrance may be jammed with great masses of drift ice, while beyond, the channel may still be open. With a current always flowing through from the north, it is easy to imagine that a great iceberg happening to be nearby would be drawn in. If it were large enough to fill up the passage, as many of them are, it would be firmly held there until crushed and broken up by the waves, hiding the strait and giving the appearance of a solid ice wall. Then too, mariners in these wild sea wastes are very cautious, seldom approaching near enough to the barriers to detect this passage even if it were open. What the depth of it is we had no means of ascertaining, for though we spliced together all the lead lines aboard the ship, we never succeeded in finding bottom anywhere. On account of the tremendous current that set through with the ship, the log was valueless, but from close observation, both going and coming, Captain Brent estimates the length of the passage to be about 25 miles. On the farther side the ice walls and sea presented practically the same features as on this, the shining cliffs running away as far as the eye could see on either hand, while the black ocean heaved with great billows that broke with continuous thunder against the barriers or threw their spray high up on the great solemn icebergs that floated in silent majesty, too immense to be shaken by Neptune in the wildest efforts of his wrath. The sun, which had been rising but a little way above the horizon for some time past, disappeared entirely soon after we got into the open sea beyond the barriers, but when the air was not filled with sleet or snow, it was never really dark. The aurora australis too, frequently lighted the sea with its weird strange glow so that it was easy for us to keep the frozen coastline in view. My object was now to circumnavigate this polar sea. Sailing eastward along the south side of the barriers until we again came in view of Mount Erebus far off to the northwest, we then headed the ship due south and soon sunk the ice-bound coast and mountain beneath the black horizon of the Antarctic Sea. My idea then was that we were in an open polar sea, ice-locked all around, and we thought to sail directly across until we reached the barriers on the opposite side and thus obtain a knowledge of its extent. Shortly after we crossed the ice barriers, the needle became erratic, deflecting more and more every day until it entirely reversed itself. The weather was fair, and we detected this by the constellations, or we would undoubtedly have sailed out of our course and turned the ship around in following the compass. 4 weeks after we passed through Barrington Strait, as I have been egotistical enough to christen it, we had storms, snow and ice, and the black ocean through which we ploughed was in no wise different from that which extends from Cape Horn to Victoria Land, except that we noticed less ice and met with no storms as severe as we encountered on this side, both going and coming. I will not weary the reader with the details of our long voyage in this hitherto unknown ocean. In the course of time, the sun again appeared, and as we drew southward, the sea became cleared of ice and the cold moderated as it does in traveling from the poles to the equator. In vain, we looked for the ice barriers, which we supposed surrounded us, only the black open sea stretched on, and we held our course. There were no exciting incidents, and 4 months after passing the barriers, we were sailing in open seas out of the region of ice and snow, with the weather constantly growing warmer. 2 months later, we encountered driftwood, and not long afterwards, seafowls appeared and grew more numerous every day. They first appeared on the starboard side, and as their number increased from day to day, including some that were unmistakably land birds, I expressed the opinion to Captain Brent that we were sailing parallel to some coast, and suggested that the ship's course be altered to make this shore. This was done, and evidences of land such as seaweed and driftwood became more apparent every day. My interest and excitement became so great that I could not be still a moment when awake, and could sleep but little. In a fever of restlessness, I walked the deck hour after hour and scanned the horizon for land, a perfectly useless waste of energy. As a man was stationed in the lookout, who of course would see the land long before it became visible from the deck. The weather was fine and we were evidently nearing land of some kind. As night closed on the 20th of July, an illumination of some kind was plainly visible on the horizon off the starboard bow and the vessel's head was turned towards it. My excitement was so great that I did not go down to my cabin for supper. The illumination grew plainer constantly and at 10 o'clock, the lookout at the masthead said he could distinguish what seemed to be electric lights. At this my hopes fell. T had been thrilled with the idea of approaching an unknown land in an unknown ocean, and now it seemed that in some way we had gotten back into the beaten track of the world and was approaching a modern city. Captain Brent was of the opinion that it was one of the cities on the west coast of South America, although it was impossible to understand how we could have gotten there as we had been sailing south by the heavens ever since we left the polar regions. In a short time, it was plainly to be seen from the deck that we were approaching a considerable city, lighted by electricity. As we neared, the land the lead was heaved constantly and after running in as close as he dared, the captain cast anchor and waited for daylight before attempting to enter the harbor. As soon as the ship was made, snug and everything became quiet on board, I was struck by the strange silence of the city that lay before us. Although evidently a large city and a modern one, if we might judge from the brilliant manner in which it was lighted, there was an entire absence of that roar and rumble which characterizes the modern American or European city. As a matter of fact, although we lay within a few miles, no sound of any kind came to us and the silence was strange and weird-like, as though it was some brilliantly illuminated city of the dead. I was awakened next morning by the creaking of the winch and the rattling of the cable as the anchor was hoisted, and dressing hurriedly I went on deck where the captain and crew were discussing the small craft that was coming out of the harbor. Even as we looked, a most remarkable boat came tearing out and pitching towards us at the rate of at least 50 miles an hour. As it came towards us, we could see only a great billow of foam and above it a covered deck something like a ferryboat or excursion barge. When it came alongside of us, we could see that the vessel, if such a thing may be called a vessel, consisted of a long cigar-shaped hull submerged after the fashion of the American whaleback, with the superstructure raised on stanchions. On each end of this cylindrical hull were great cone-shaped screws somewhat larger than the hull itself, and it was these that raised the billows of foam as they leaped through the water, pushing and dragging the strange-looking boat. A uniformed pilot was put aboard, and a towing hawser thrown to the men in the bow. Saluting and speaking perfect English, though with a peculiar accent, the pilot asked what vessel it was. On being informed that it was the Wanderer of New York, United States of America, he dropped his jaw, stretched his eyes and looked altogether as upset as if he had been told that it was the Flying Dutchman. "What land is this?" asked Captain Brent in turn. "The Iron Republic, sir," replied the pilot, again saluting, and advancing to the wheel. In response to our further questioning, he courteously stated that he was an officer on duty, that it was against the rules for him to hold any conversation except in reference to the ship, and begged us to curb our curiosity until we got ashore, when all the information we desired would be afforded us. There was nothing else for us to do, so Captain Brent turned his attention to lowering and furling the sails, which had been hoisted, and by the time everything was made snug, we were alongside the pier. As soon as we were made fast, another officer came on board, and he, like the pilot, seemed to be dumbfounded when he learned that the vessel hailed from the United States of America. After inspecting the ship's papers, he turned to Captain Brent and informed him that the circumstances of our arrival were so unusual and unprecedented in his experience that he would be under the necessity of conducting him to the office of the Director of Navigation. Thereupon, the captain introduced me as owner and the proper person to deal with, and the officer politely requested me to accompany him. "Sir," said I, as we passed through the curious throng that had gathered on the wharf, "will you be kind enough to tell me what country this is and in what part of the world it lies?" "This," he replied, is the Iron Republic, and the continent on which you stand lies about as far from the frozen ocean as your own continent of America does in the opposite direction. Just here, having reached the outskirts of the crowd, he made a signal, and a man approached with a horseless vehicle and dismounting saluted and opened the door of his carriage. Forbearing to question further an officer of whose power and authority I had not the slightest idea, and whose extreme courtesy forbade impertinence, I took my place in the carriage and was whirled along wide, smooth streets through the heart of the city. I have remarked that though we lay just outside of the harbor and inside of the city for some hours before entering, we heard none of that roar and rumble inseparable from cities of its apparent size among us. The reason was now plain. In the first place, the streets were all as smooth as a tennis court, and there was nothing to make a noise. There was not a horse to be seen, and it was evident from the floor-like cleanliness of the streets that they were not intended for the use of horses and wagons. On all sides were horseless vehicles of every description, from the lightest bicycles to large covered vans, all rubber-tired, whirling to and fro swiftly and without noise. I had only time to note the things referred to and to remark the strange and picturesque costumes of the ladies and gentlemen who were on the street, when my conductor drew up before a large substantial stone building covering an entire block. Stepping down from the carriage, he assisted me to alight and ushered me into a large and well-lighted reception room in the front of the building. I noticed as we approached that a blue flag with a white star floated from the tower on the roof, and surmised that in some way the two officers with whom I had been brought in contact and the building, which we had just entered, represented the same department of government. Conducting me to one of the comfortable seats with which the room was supplied, my companion excused himself by saying that the gentleman who met me at the boat would be with me in a few minutes, and withdrew. Scarcely had he passed through the door when the person deferred to tune in, having presumably ridden up after us in his own carriage. Smiling pleasantly, he expressed the hope that I would not be annoyed by the little conventionalities to which I was being subjected, saying that my arrival was so extraordinary and so out of common with all other entries made since he had been connected with the Marine, that he had no other recourse but to refer me to the head of the department. I assured him that I was under obligations for his courteous attention, that a stranger as I was and dazed by the extraordinary circumstances in which I found myself, I was in a condition to absolutely require guidance and direction. He desired me to consider myself under no restraint whatever, stating that I was being referred to the Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, because he was at a loss to know how to place me on the Marine Register. Opening a door, he conducted me without ceremony into the presence of a gentleman whom he introduced as Director of Navigation and Chief of the Department of the Marine. This officer, notwithstanding his evident high position, rose and smiling cordially bowed and asked us both to be seated. In a few words, the subordinate explained to his superior the circumstances of my arrival and asked for instructions in certain matters pertaining to the registering of my vessel. These were given, and then the high official with rare feeling and tact arose and grasped my hand and welcomed me to the Iron Republic, saying that though it might lack the associations which must make my native country pleasant, it possessed advantages and attractions which he believed, from what he had been able to learn, could not be found in America. I thanked him for his cordial greeting and assured him that while some associations of my own country had been pleasant, others were very unpleasant, and upon the whole, I was glad to have found my way to the Iron Republic, whatever and wherever it might be. After inquiring into the details of my voyage, in which he manifested great interest, the director remarked that the astonishment of his countrymen at my arrival would naturally be much less than mine, inasmuch as they had a very thorough knowledge of my country. It was known, he said, from the settlement of his country that the American continent existed, indeed that it was the attempt of a shipload of emigrants to get to America that led to the discovery of the continent on which the magnificent structure of government known as the Iron Republic had been reared. This was in 1698, and driven southward by fierce gales, the colonists, after many months of battling with storm and ice, found themselves cast on